Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar. Today's webinar is on how do I debug this form. Today's presenter will be Jonathan Su, and I'll be your host, and my name's Berit Johannesson. The next thing I want us to go through is the announcements. So we do have our Zerion Power User Summit, and I'll go into a little bit more details on what that is in just a little bit. But that's coming up in September. Also, at the end of August, in just a couple weeks or next week, we have the Form Builder Recertification or Form Builder Advanced Form Building. We call it recertification because you have to go through the initial form building certification to then attend the advanced certification. This is really a great time to review your skills if you've been certified, as well as enhance them by learning more page-level JavaScript. We have some additional upcoming webinars. So on the 30th of August, we have Getting Started with Data Flow Automation. If you're interested in learning more about data flow automation, this is a great webinar to attend to see if that platform interests you. On the 7th of September, we have the Common JavaScript and Form Building webinar. For those of you who are using smart controls or looking to start using them more, I highly suggest attending that webinar. And the last one at the end of September is what are Zerion documents and reports. So this will be a great time for you, again, to learn more about some of the other Zerion web services and see if you can start to leverage them. So as I mentioned before, we do have the Power User Summit coming up in September. It's September 13th, but not only is it just that one day, we do have two certification trainings happening on Monday and Tuesday. We have Form Builder certification as well as Data Flow Automation certification. These are both on site and at the same time and half day sessions. So I highly suggest checking those out if you are looking for in-person certification. Also on the Thursday of that week, we have documents training as well as reports. The actual event is a free event. The only thing you'll have to pay for is if you do want to attend the Form Builder certification or Data Flow certification. Again, this is an awesome opportunity to come meet our team, but also meet other customers and really learn more about the platform, more about our company and what we stand for and the direction that we're moving in. The next thing that I want to make sure that everyone is aware of is that we are recording today's session, and in the next 48 hours, we'll send out that recording so that you'll have access to it, as well as all the resources we've shared with you here, and any additional resources like the form that John's going to go through will be available on our public website, but also everyone who's attended will be added to Zerion Academy and have access to the course there. Before I hand over the rights to John, I am going to do a quick poll to kind of learn who our listeners are today. So the first question we're asking you, if you're current users. So if everyone could go ahead and quickly fill that out, that would be very helpful. All right, so almost everyone has attended or has responded. And John, it looks like it's a pretty even match here. We've got about 40% who mainly make new forms, some 40% who mainly edit existing ones, and we also have some individuals who are not current users at all. And before I hand it back to you, John, let's quickly go through one other poll. And for those of you who are building forms or have been building forms for a while, if you could select what areas of the form building that you usually have trouble with. And from the responses, it's very interesting. It's some that we see often, which is the caching of the old values. But some of the page-level JavaScript, I think if people haven't been using page-level JavaScript, then they most likely aren't running into any trouble with that. So at this point, John, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and hand it back to you.
Thanks, Berit. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm actually really excited to do this webinar. I had the idea to do this webinar because, through doing trainings and working with customers, being on chat and trying to support people in their form building, I found myself going through kind of a standard practice, and it's really formalized over the most recent months in terms of what I do when I have to debug a form. And so I wanted to go ahead and share these experiences with you, share the knowledge I've gained from them, and hopefully what that will do is that'll make your form building process a smoother one. Now, the way we're going to go through this webinar today is we're going to start off by me sharing with you all my debugging checklist. And so these are going to be things that I check immediately whenever I have someone who has a question about a form that's not working properly. After that, we're going to talk about how I set up my workspace to both debug forms that have current problems in them, as well as set up my workspace in a way that it will prevent me from making too many mistakes as I build new content as well. That was one of the reasons we had the poll structured that way, is because this webinar is not only going to focus on, something isn't working and I need to fix it, which is really the primary realm of debugging. But one of the other things that I've come to find is that the best way to have a good debugging experience is to be able to be preventative in your mistakes. And so I want to go through some proactive things that people will be able to do in order to minimize the amount of debugging they have to go through. After that, what I want to do is I want to walk everyone through how to safely design forms. So what I've done for today's webinar is I have a form made with some elements in it already. Some of the content is already created. We're going to go through that form. We're going to do a review of it. I'm going to be able to talk about some of these debugging checklist topics that I have, as well as some of the workspace concepts. And then we're going to go through and actually fix this form. As we go through that process, I will show you how I debug forms. I will also talk about each of the different steps I make and the decisions involved with them. Now, as Barrett had mentioned earlier with the control panel and asking questions and raising your hand, as I go through that, I definitely want to encourage people to ask questions if they start to get lost or if they don't understand why I'm doing something. Debugging is not just an exercise in skills and knowledge, it's also an exercise in decision making. So I want to make sure everyone knows why I'm doing the things that I'm doing. And then to wrap everything up, what I want to do is go through some recommended practices for all of the attendees. These are things that I see people make mistakes with frequently. They're also things that I make mistakes with frequently. And so I wanted to go ahead and give you a little bit of like a cheat sheet to keep in mind next time you go through building forms. Now, the first question we really have to ask is, when do you debug a form, right? So let's set the context here. Let's set the scenario. There's two main reasons you're going to be looking to say, hey, I need to debug this form. The first one is when your app is crashing. And this is going to be any time where you're trying to open up the app and it's not running. And a lot of times your initial instinct is to think, well, hey, the software is not working. But that's not necessarily the case. One of the things that we always do first is we go into the form properties and we always double check those. If you have reference IDs at the page level, or if you're using media configurations to do image icons working with Dropbox, these are things that may cause the app to function improperly. You'll want to check these first. And one of the easiest ways to check them is just to systematically kind of remove one, see if it makes the form work, put it back, and you can slowly start to isolate the problem and figure out what's going on. Now, if you get to the point where you've taken out your reference IDs, your media configurations at that form properties page and things are still not working, then you may want to look into, hey, maybe I found a bug that is not something that I can fix, and then that's a good opportunity to reach out to us. The second scenario, when you're going to be looking at debugging a form, and this is probably going to be the one that the majority of this webinar focuses on, is, hey, I'm building a form, or someone gave me this form and I tried to make changes to it, and my smart controls are not working. And for the people who are not current form builders, I know there were some of you in the attendees here, smart controls are going to be the category or the title that we give for any sort of functionality that is going to be beyond just add an element, fill it in. So some of the most common smart controls you're going to see are dynamic values, which are when you pre-populate a field, or a condition value, which is when you hide a field. So if the condition is true or false, you either hide or you show it. I'm also going to walk you through page-level JavaScript, which is an opportunity for you to write some JavaScript code that will be able to be applied throughout the form and not necessarily just to one element, which smart controls are all normally linked to. Smart controls are normally on a per element basis. Your page-level JavaScript allows you to write commands and statements that will be able to be used across multiple elements. And so again, those are the two main reasons where you will not want to go and look at debugging your form. If the app is crashing, you're going to want to look at your form properties and start tweaking those to see if you can isolate the issue. Or if your form is loading fine and your app is loading, but the elements are not behaving properly, your smart controls are not working the right way, then you want to look into how to fix these things. So assuming we're looking at smart controls, you always want to have a starting point. And these are really the 5 things that I find myself asking, or I find me asking myself each time I get a form that I need to debug. And so this is going to be under the context of, hey, I got a form from somebody, I need to edit this form and figure out why it's not working. The first thing I check is always the data column names. So I want to check to make sure that they are spelled correctly and that they're also referenced correctly. That second part, what I mean is if you have multiple elements, you want to make sure that you're calling the correct element. A lot of times we'll see people, and I've been victim of this as well, where I'm not very specific with my data column names and it's easy to mix them up. I might be pointing to the wrong element, or I may have just misspelled my data column name. These are both common mistakes that I make, and I find myself catching all the time. That's why this is number 1 on the list. It's the first thing I look at. The second thing you want to look at is your syntax. And so when I say syntax, what I'm talking about is within the smart controls and when you're working with JavaScript, things like making sure your parentheses match, making sure that you're using curly braces at the correct positions. If you're writing in page level JavaScript, making sure that you have semicolons. All of the characters and the structure that makes the smart controls work, you want to make sure that those are correct. Now this seems like a really simple task and a very small oversight, but I promise you, especially with me when I develop forms, these 2 things catch about 80 to 90% of the mistakes I make. It's very easy to just misspell something or just to mistype it, and it's also very, very easy to misplace a quotation mark or a parentheses or a curly brace. For those of you who have gone through form building as an experience, I'm sure you've run into the same thing. For the new people who are not that experienced with form building, when you do run into this, I promise you it is not something that is uncommon. And basically don't beat yourself up over it. It happens to everybody. The third thing I ask myself after I look through those 2 things is if all the elements involved in smart controls have default values. So what that means is we're able to use the dynamic value to set an element's the number or the value of an element to a specific input by default. The reason this is important is if you don't have a default value in there, the app is going to try to take a previous value that was stored there in order to run faster. So part of the optimization process is the app will go through what's called caching, where once it takes a value, it stores that value and tries to use it whenever it can, so it doesn't have to redo calculations. If you've ever run into the issue where you fill out a form and it's nice and neat, everything works great, you press done, you sync your device, the record goes up, everything is fine. Then when you go in to make a new record, you say, hey, some of these fields have my old values in them. That's a caching mistake. And the reason it happens is the app is trying to run quickly, and it is taking the previous value because that's what it has stored recently. In order to avoid this, we have to give elements a default value so that it will default to that value, and then it will use that instead of the cached value each time you open a new form. The fourth thing I ask myself, if I've gone through these first 3 things and I still am having problems, is I want to make sure that the form behaves the same for iOS and Android. Now in terms of the elements we offer and the functionalities, we're very, very close to being identical with the 2 operating systems. That being said, each operating system does have its own JavaScript library that it uses for applications, and that's not just iForm or data collector. That is across the entire device. And so there are some inconsistencies in the JavaScript that you want to accommodate for. One of the things I wanted to make sure to go through this webinar was talking about that. Now, the easiest way to do this is if you have access to a device of both operating systems, that's fantastic. Just check the form on both of them. That's great. One of the other things I always recommend people do is to go to the Customer Success Center and look up literature on the task you're trying to perform. We do our best to note when certain functionalities work on one operating system or not the other. In the event that we don't have that on there, it's also great for you to let us know, and we'll be sure to update those articles. Now, if all the spelling is right, your syntax is correct, your smart controls are good, and the form function is the same on both operating systems, one of the last things I do before I really start getting into the nitty-gritty of a form is to clean the local database. We see this fixing a lot of problems specifically with page-level JavaScript and smart controls that use page-level JavaScript. Sometimes that will cache as well. So your JavaScript functions will basically be stored, and cleaning the local database is the best way of wiping all that out and making sure you're starting with a fresh slate. And so I always have that as kind of this fifth step that I do when I'm debugging forms. Now, all of this is done at the initial onset. There are plenty of times where when I'm going through a form and debugging it, these 5 steps don't fix it. So in the event they don't fix it, then I have to start diving a little bit deeper.
So John, I mean, these are 5 steps and some of them can take somewhat of a long time. Mm-hmm. So how do you handle this when you have a really long and big form with multiple subforms?
It's a really good question. And that happens quite frequently, actually, especially when we have support requests for people when they have their forms and they try to make a change and it didn't function correctly. The best way to really do that is to start to isolate kind of the bug or what is not working correctly. And there's 2 ways to do that. The first thing you can do is within the form, you can start to disable or deactivate elements so that you're reducing the number of variables or the number of moving pieces inside of the form. Your ultimate goal is to work towards a simple form that only has that one issue in it so that you can work on it kind of in a safe space and then apply it back to the larger context. So disabling elements is one way to do that. Another thing I've found that's very successful in the past is I will take the elements that are in question and I'll actually make a new form and put them in there. So I'll kind of recreate the problem in that new form. Now, when I add the elements over to the new form, one of 2 things is going to happen. Either the mistake will still be there, but the good thing is with that, I now know the mistake is in what I copied over. And from there, I can fix it. The second thing is that I'll move the stuff over and then, hey, now it works as intended, and that's really strange. That is actually also very valuable information because that tells you that the portion of the form that you moved over is correct. And now that means that there's something else, an unknown variable in one of the other elements that is causing your form to misbehave. And so then you want to go back to the same process of isolating different sections of your form, changing only one thing at a time so that you know for certainty that that is the driver or it's not, and then going through your form in a very methodical fashion. Ultimately, if you have a really, really long form, there's not a lot you can do in terms of just being super quick about it. So going back to that concept of being preventative, if you're building out a new form, you definitely want to have a very quick feedback loop. You want to develop a little bit, test it to make sure it works. Develop a little bit, test to make sure it works. You don't want to be too long in your development cycle. Barrett, do you think that answers your question or your concern?
Yep, I think it does. Thank you.
Problem.
There are some other questions coming in, but I'm handling them for now. And if any of them would apply to everyone else, I'll be sure to let you know.
Awesome. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is setting up my workspace to show you all how I get ready to debug a form. It's going to be doing a couple of things. I'm going to be making sure I open up all my forms in my option lists. I'm going to be using my table view. I'm going to make sure I have my devices set up. And then these bottom 2 things, using option list key values as well as simplifying the problem through prototyping, I'm going to be able to show you those through the form more so than tell you about them. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my workspace right now. Barrett, I believe we have a poll set up that we can ask everyone while I go through this.
Sure thing. So I've just launched the poll. If everyone could go ahead and respond to it. This poll is saying, when I build forms, I frequently, and you can select one or more of the following options. Do you forget to use or misspell data column names? Do you miss JavaScript syntax? Do you forget to default elements used in smart controls? Or do you forget to check the Customer Success Center for additional articles on how to do things? I know for me, I definitely forget the syntax, or I I usually forget to default elements in the smart controls, but let's see what everyone else has to say too. All right, so we almost have all the responses in, and it's pretty even across the board except for forgetting to default elements used in smart controls. And again, that's one that I always do too. So I'm right there with everyone else who selected that one.
I am as well. That is almost always what I miss.
With that, John, are you all set?
I am just about all set, yes.
All right, perfect. So I'll go ahead and I'll close the poll and hand it back to you.
Perfect. So what I have here in my browser is a couple of things. You'll notice I have multiple tabs open. And that speaks again to opening up all my forms, my option lists. So I'm going to start over here, and I'll have my parent form. I have a subform, and then I have one option list, two option lists. And these are kind of what I'm going to be working with throughout the webinar. I'm going to set these condition values to be shown because I do have some smart controls with them.
So John, just before you go any further here, for those individuals who are new to building forms, I mean, I understand why you put these in the order that you did, but how can you quickly identify which form you're actually in? Sure.
I mean, for this webinar, what I did was I just opened the parent on the left, actually. And one of the things that I really should have been doing, and I'm not going to be able to make the change right now because it's going to break the smart controls, so I actually messed up my own best practice, is you want to be able to identify parent-child forms very easily. The way we recommend you do this is by adding an _p at the end of a parent level form. And then if you're in a subform or a child form, adding an _c like this. So that's the best practice. I don't have in here. I tried to keep the data column names a little bit more straightforward just for the purposes of looking at the smart controls, but that's what I would normally do.
And John, I do want to emphasize that if, let's say you walked away and came back and forgot what order you had put this in, at the very bottom of the screen, you're able to see the form name and the form label.
Yes, so that's actually a very good point. Let me see here. Refresh this real quick. So what Barrett was talking about is down here there's a small footer that's very easy to miss. I actually miss it sometimes too, even though I use it quite frequently. But this form name, being able to copy this easily, actually saves me a lot of time. So I wanted to highlight that. Now, after I have all of this open, the next thing I'm actually going to do, assuming that I'm editing a form here, I don't edit forms, especially smart controls, in this view very frequently. What I prefer to do is go up here and use the table view, because this allows me to now show the condition value and the dynamic value for my elements along with the data column name. And what you're going to find is this is really easy to do things like copy and paste to set up my smart controls. So I almost always work with my smart controls in this view. What I'll do is I will add elements to my form first, and then once all the elements are in here, I will then modify them using this view. Now, before I go any further into the actual form, I do want to show you all what the form looks like. I have the form open twice here. Now, on the left-hand side, I have this on iOS, and on the right-hand side, I have this on Android. So there's a couple of things I want to go through with this form. When I open it first initially, you'll see that the form has 3 sections to it. Actually, it has 4. The first section is going to be an area where I'm calculating a rectangle's an area. So I'm going to give it a length and a width, like this. Go 4. We'll set the width to 9. And then it should calculate the area. Now, right away, you'll notice that I have the area calculation 3 times. I'm going to go through the differences in each one of them and then some considerations with how the form is. The second one is going to be a segmented option list where I pick a letter and it will show me all the states for that letter. The third one is going to be a multi-select where depending on what I choose, it will again segment to show me values for each one of my choices. And this fourth one, employee notes, I'm going to save for later. I'm going to make sure I talk about it at that point. I don't want to go through it right now because I want to make sure we can focus on what I have currently. Now, when we open this form initially, a couple of things you'll notice. The first thing is that right here, this number is 36 and 36, but I don't have any values up here. I didn't put in anything. Now, if you're paying attention closely, I had entered a 9 and a 4 for the length and the width in my previous form that I'd opened. This is an example of a caching error, where it's taking the value from the previous form that I filled out, and it's using it to do the calculation. Now, in order to fix this, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be setting a default value inside of my dynamic value for the length as well as for the width. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. You'll see in the literature on the help desk that you see this quite frequently, using a dynamic value with the curly braces. Sometimes you'll also see it just as a standalone value. I've gotten in the habit of actually using the data column name and setting it explicitly equal to a value. Now, the thing with this is it's not a requirement, but what I found is this minimizes my inconsistencies between the two operating systems. And so I've gotten used to taking this slightly longer step for the purposes of preventing future problems. Once I make those changes here, you'll see that these are set to yellow. I'm going to save it. This is another part of building your forms safely, is making sure you save your work and your progress quite frequently. The additional thing is when you're debugging forms, you don't want to make too many changes too quickly, because this way, if you do, you're not going to know which change fixed the problem. As I sync these two forms, what you'll notice is when I open them up, now I don't have these values cached from before. And you'll notice also that the numbers are defaulted to 0, which I set as the dynamic value. Now, when I enter in a number here, you'll see that the values update correctly. In the event that I open up a new version of this form, my calculations have been zeroed out. So this is the behavior that I'm looking for. Now, as I fill these numbers out, we're going to move on to the next step of this form, which is that my area calculations, 2 of them worked, but this one did not, this middle one. This one is staying at 0. Let me go into the page level JavaScript by clicking on the double curly braces icon up here in the upper right and show you what the JavaScript looks like. Now, both of these functions are very similar and they're supposed to calculate the same thing. I want to calculate the area of my rectangle by doing a multiplication of the 2 values. Here I call them x and y. Here I specifically reference the data column name length and the data column name width from my parent form. Now, for those of you who are more advanced form builders and have worked with page level JavaScript before, this is a neat little trick that some people don't realize they can do. They don't realize that they can actually reference any value in the form inside of a function. You don't have to include it in the parameter list, which is going to be what's between these parentheses. Down here, you see that we have 2 parameters or 2 values that are needed. We call them x and y. We're going to multiply them and then return or output that calculation. Now, you'll notice that the function calls for each of them are different as well. This is the one that uses the full form structure, and this is the one that does not work. This down here is the one that uses x and y, and so what happens is we pass the value from length, the value from width. They are stored in x and y respectively, and then used inside of the function. So at this point, we have this function here, and we have to start debugging this. We've got to figure out what is wrong. Why is this function not working? The first thing I want to do with this function is to see if it works ever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to set these to actual numbers. My thought process here is I want to see if the function is actually doing the calculation correctly. When I have everything set to 0, I'm not sure if it's not working, or if it is working and 0 times 0 just happens to be the number 0. By giving these default values, now what I'm able to do, as I go back in here, and I sync these two, is to look at the forms, and you'll notice that the calculation for the area does work. You'll see here I do get 100 here. So now I know that the JavaScript inside of my function is correct. It's functioning properly. I gave it numbers and it did the calculation correctly. From here, the next thing I want to see is, okay, well, what happens when I update this? So if I change 10 to say 5, you'll notice that these two updated. This one stayed the same. And so before, when we had them all as zeros, I wasn't sure what the actual behavior I was looking at was. I didn't know if it wasn't working. I didn't know if it wasn't updating. I've now isolated this problem. I know it was working because I put in default values at the top. When I change the values, now I realize that it is not updating. Going back to our previous discussion, whenever you have a value that's being an old calculation, we normally think that that's a caching error. And this is actually a small niche behavior that I think a lot of people are unaware of. They know that element values can cache, but what they don't realize is that actually function values can cache as well. Now, I found this out through a series of tests that I ran over time, but I want to share this knowledge with you again as a preventative measure. The reason this function updates down here and this one does not update is because what is being passed to the function changes down here. So as I change the length and as I change the width, that's going to change x and y. So that means the function knows, hey, I need to run again, so I see what the new value is. Up here, nothing is passed to the function. So when I change values, the function has no idea that its output should have been different. It doesn't know that because it only sees the inputs. For that reason, the function will not execute again. Once the function doesn't execute again, that's why it's always going to maintain the same value. What I'm going to do is do a hybrid of the two. So if I actually put in values here for this top function, but I don't use the values, I'm still going to reference the values directly through the form structure. Let me save this. I have to make the change to my function, and I have to make the corresponding change to my dynamic value. So again, I'm passing in length and width, but I'm not using them. If we go back over here and take a look, what we should see is that we start off here, calculations look good. Now because this value changes, the input to the function changes, and thus both of them are going to update. So at this point now we fixed this middle function, we know what's wrong with it. The issue was that if it doesn't know something changed, it's not going to re-execute. And this is an example of page level JavaScript caching as well as elements caching. Barrett, are there any questions that have come up so far? I know that this can be a kind of a hard thing to grasp and to understand at first, so I want to make sure that I give it proper time.
Hi, John. There are some questions. I'm responding to them, but nothing that I think you need to cover at this time.
Okay, thank you. All right, so that is my first example here. So now moving on to the second example, I want to do a quick recap and show you all the behavior I want to debug here. So for this form, if I choose a letter, I get these states that I can choose from. Okay? I'll do the same thing on my Android tablet. I'm going to choose G, and then you'll see it pre-populates with Georgia because that is the only state in my option list that starts with the letter G. Where we run into issues is if I close this out and say I start a new form, If I go over here to states, there's nothing shown because I haven't picked an alphabet letter yet. If I go over here on Android, you'll notice that Georgia, this segment of my option list, is cached. Now, from what I've said previously, you may have been able to determine that this is actually two errors wrapped up in one use case. So the first problem is that we have a caching error. Georgia is caching. The second problem is that it's only caching on one operating system. So on iOS, we're not running into this behavior. So we have operating system inconsistencies, as well as a lack of a default value that would have prevented the caching from happening in the first place. Now, before I go through fixing this form, I want to talk about the structure of it a little bit. I think this is helpful for new form builders. And then even for experienced form builders, I want to make sure that you all are following best practices. This is my option list for my states. And you'll notice I have inside of this form an element called alphabet, and this is where I choose the letter from the alphabet. And I'm using the ZC display key to look for the key value inside of the letter or the alphabet option list. Now, if you're an experienced form builder and have been working with forms for a long time, you may have become accustomed to using the index value, which is going to be a numeric number. We've since reframed that and called it a sort order because you can now rearrange options in an option list. But we want to encourage you to move off of that practice. Using ZC display key is going to run a comparison with the key value. And so actually, let me open up my other option list with the alphabet and show you what this looks like. So my alphabet option list is going to be a label and a key value that happens to match it. And so instead of comparing with the index or the sort order, because I'm using ZC display key, I'm going to match with the key value. Now, the reason we want you to match the key value rather than the sort order is because the key value is going to be the least likely property to change. In the event you want to rearrange your options in an option list, you would be manipulating the sort order. In that scenario, all your smart controls that work with the sort order have now been broken because you're not pointing to the same option anymore. Similarly with your label, the label is the text that the app user sees on their option list. And we see a lot of times people will come back, the data collectors will come back and say, hey, I don't understand what these options mean. Can you clear up the label a little bit? And so the label text then needs to be changed, updated, or altered. In that scenario, again, you would have your smart controls be broken if you're using the labels text as your comparison. The key value, on the other hand, is going to be two things. One, it's going to be the value that is stored actually in the database table, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. The second thing is that your key value actually has to be unique. So it's okay if I have two labels that are both capital A, but I cannot have two key values that are both capital A. Your key value must be unique. And so when you match the key value, you can be confident that you're only going to get one response back. You don't have to worry about there being multiple responses that match your criteria. Now, we've got to go in and take a look at this caching error and then fix it and see what our outcome is afterwards. So for my pick list, we're not going to default it the same way by giving it a number. The way we're going to work with the pick list is we're actually going to use the data column name is equal to the value -1. Now, in order to understand why I set this to -1, we've got to go back and look at the option list. The option list sort order starts at 0 and it increments by 1 as we go through our options. That's going to be a standard practice. By setting it to -1, that is the form builder way of saying, I want this to be empty at the start. So when I start my form, I want this pick list to be empty. I'm going to save this, again, one change at a time. And so now what we want to do, we know it worked on iOS, so let's go over here to Android and test this out. I'm going to resync my device. And open this up. I'm going to choose a letter. This shows up like it did before. We'll discard my change, and let's try again and see if it caches. So it doesn't show anything, so that is a good sign, but what I want to do additionally is go into states, and it's still there. So if we're here, this is okay, and we're good here. So my behavior is not changed on Android, but what I want to do is go over on iOS and see if this has stayed consistent, because again, we're tackling two problems at the same time. Alphabet, pick a letter, this is good. And then when I go in here to check again, that has not cached, and so we're okay. Whoops, there are no states that start with B. All right, so at this point, I've gone through my checklist. I checked both operating systems. I made sure it had a default value the correct way, and I still am running into problems. So from here, what do? We have a couple of different options. First option we can do is we can try to set this to an actual value. So I'll say alphabet equals 0. Now I'm using the sort order to reference this letter A because I want to see if it will default to that letter. So I'm going to go ahead and reset.
Now, John, a lot of times when we talk about option lists and best practices, we say use ZC display key or ZC display value. Is there a reason you're using the sort order for this one?
Yeah, the reason I'm using the sort order for this one is because when you set a value as a default value in the form builder, I've always done it to the index. I actually don't, Barrett, are you able to set the value through the key value?
You should be able to, yep.
I'm going to go ahead and try that in a second then. So this is good, okay? I talked through this as I loaded this up, but when I opened the form, A was shown first. This was segmented this way. So now what I want to do is go to C. This makes sense. And if I go back, I'm going to check to see if there's a caching error. Okay, so A is shown. This is here, okay? And so now I've again isolated my possible mistake to know that the segment is working properly. It has to do with the way I'm setting a default value. So Barrett, let's go ahead and try that out. So we would go alphabet equals, how would we be doing this? ZC display key.
So you'd actually set it up with the ZC display key underscore alphabet and then have it equals whatever the key value is in the quotes.
Got it. So we'll go ZC display key alphabet equals. So what if we want it to default to be blank?
I haven't tried that.
We will find out together. While I go through this, I do want to let everyone know that another part of debugging is playing. A lot of times we learn these things by just trying things out, kind of like this. And so you all get a front row seat at me trying this for the first time. So this is good. We'll go back. Now let's take a look. Oops, didn't mean to sync there, but shouldn't matter. This is not cached. Barrett, that was awesome.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Very cool. All right. This is good. Everyone is learning new things today. Were there any questions that came up about the option list with pick lists?
Not so much about the option list, but one question came about, or I guess someone ran into an issue on their own and brought it to our attention. And one thing I recommended to them is to make sure that everyone is using the same version of the app, because that could also help with the debugging. So I just wanted to mention that to everybody else too. That's
a really good tip, actually. That yeah, keep in mind that the software, like, we're constantly trying to make changes and improvements to it. Sometimes those are in the form of optimizations, and that can have adverse effects in rare occasions to your smart controls. Again, going back to the idea of isolating variables, you want to make sure that the form or the app version is the same across all your test devices. So the next thing I want to do is move down to my...
The only thing I want to add is not just test devices, but your end users too.
Yes. let's move down to this next section here, where I'm going to be setting up the ZWS services. Now the way this works is right now, there's nothing shown here because this is again a segmented option list. Over here I can pick one of, or not one of, but I can pick up to 3 different services. So if I pick data collector, it's going to show me the different actions that are available within that. If I choose identity access management as well as data collector, it will show me the data collector options as well as the identity access management options. So this is a multi-select segmenting another multi-select, which I think again is a use case that I see quite frequently from customers and when they need. I'm going to do the same thing over here, and this looks okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to exit and reopen both of these. Again, checking for caching errors. So we're going to go down to the actions, and we see this caching mistake here one more time. Okay. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through the same process we did before, and we are going to default values. So I jump down here to my multi-select for the initial. Now, one of the things that we like to do, and actually Barrett, if you wouldn't mind, I know that there's an article on the Customer Success Center on defaulting multi-selects. If you could grab that and copy and paste it for everyone into the chat, that would be really great while I'm typing this out.
Sure thing.
So I'm going to use the data column name ZWS services equals, and I'm going to do this first because I want to show people 2 things with this scenario. I'm going to set it equal to a value first. Actually, I'm going to back up. I'm going to set it equal to an empty array. So this is basically an empty list, 2 square brackets. Now, if you're not familiar with this syntax, that's okay. I just want to let you all know that I do have a bit of a cheat sheet at the end of this that's going to give you a list of very common default values that you can use as a reference later on. So by setting this to be empty, we hopefully should remove our caching errors. We'll take a look. And we see, oops, wrong one, over here, still no caching. Over here, we get no caching now. So that's good. We actually fixed it on both sides. Okay. Now, this happened actually to me last week, and so I wanted to share this experience with everybody. We had someone who wanted to have the multi-select defaulted. So then what we did was we again looked using the help desk article. I'll give you an example of this where I would default this to have this option chosen, DC, which is the key value for data collector. Let me go ahead and save this. And we will refresh both of our forms. What I want you to notice is that on the left-hand side, data collector is defaulted, like we use in our smart control. On the right-hand side here, data collector is not shown. So the ability to default the multi-select is one of the few inconsistencies we have between iOS and Android. With the article that Barrett sent everyone, there is a note in there that says this is an iOS-only capability. And so what I want to highlight to people again is that idea that if something is not working as intended, to not only check on both operating systems, but also to check on the Customer Success Center for the literature that we have there, because that's going to be a really good way for you to make sure that you're not wasting your time. Check to make sure what you're trying to do can actually be done first, if it doesn't work initially when you go through and try it. For the final example in this webinar, we're going to be looking at an aggregation function that I'm going to write for a subform. Now, taking a look at the subform, it's called employee notes here. And what you'll see is when I fill this in, the first element is a pick list. And the second one is going to be a text area, which we can avoid and ignore for the purposes of this example. Now, I can fill out this subform multiple times. And the behavior I'm going to be looking for is, as I fill this out, I'm going to want to add an element underneath employee notes that's going to keep track of all the employee names as a comma-separated list. Now, before we get started, what we're going to have to do is a little bit of prep work on the subform, because when I pass the values over, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to have the label, not the key value, not the sort order. So I'm going to add a text element underneath employee. I'm going to call this employee name. And I'm going to use the dynamic value ZC display value to use the label employee, which is the subform, or which is the data column name for this pick list. Now, because the data collector does not need to see this, I'm also going to set a condition value of false for this element. I'm going to save this in preparation for the next changes we make. Now, inside of this form, I'm going to do two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a text element. This is going to be the element that's going to hold my employee list. So I'll call this employee list. And now the next thing I need to do is begin writing my page level JavaScript function to accomplish this aggregation. Now, one of the things that I always recommend doing when we write out our page level JavaScript functions is to start by kind of prototyping it, or just making sure that the function is executing the correct way you expect it to before you start writing out a whole lot of code inside of it. So the first steps here are going to be to define my function. I'm going to call it getList. And notice I write out all the syntax first. I find it that doing this prevents me from making a lot of syntactical errors. I just feel like it's a little bit safer, a little bit easier to make sure you don't miss anything. Now, if we remember from before when we had this function calc area, with no parameters, this function did not update. Even though we changed values inside of here, because the parameter list did not change, the function did not re-execute. So we must include something here. One of the techniques I prefer to do, and I recommend using, is to pass the subform's length as a parameter. This way, every time you add a new record, or even if you remove a record, the length is going to be updated and the function is going to re-execute. So now what I'm going to do real quickly is just return L, so the length. So this function does nothing more than take in a value and spit it right back out. The purpose of this really simple step in this function is to make sure, again, everything is being moved through properly and we don't run into any errors early on. I'm going to call my function getList, and now I need to pass in this subform length to my function. Now, the way I found works best is by using the form name dot data column name of the subform dot length. I found that it reduces the caching errors, it reduces any time where it doesn't update properly. This has been the most consistent solution from my experiences. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to go back to my device, I'm going to resync it, and we're going to take a look to see what we get. Okay, we have two forms downloaded. That would make sense. The parent form had changes, as well as the subform. Now inside of my form, we'll notice at the bottom, employee list is empty right now. That makes sense because nothing's been filled in. And now if I choose a person, finish one record, I get that length of 1. Now, just to confirm, I'm going to go ahead and do another record. And I get a list of 2. That's perfect. So now we know our function is being called correctly. We know that we're not running into any errors. At this point, we can begin to add more to our function. The first thing I'm going to do is define a variable called list. And this is going to be the variable that is responsible for holding my list of names. Now I'm also going to return list at the very end. So again, I kind of write out the structure and I'm going to build out to in layers. Now, we know that this is only going to return something if we have at least one value. So what I want to start by doing is setting list equal to how do I debug this form, which is the name of the form, dot employee notes. This is the subform element. I'm going to use 0 to begin with, which is going to be the first record in the subform, dot employee name, which is the text element I made to hold the label of my pick list. What this should do is return the first name that I choose in my subform. So we'll go back and take a look. We'll refresh this, we'll resync it, and then we'll start a new record. Now the purpose of this step, again, is to make sure that I'm referencing the variables correctly. I don't want to jump right into more advanced code before I know that I'm pointing to the right things and they're being called back correctly. So we'll choose another person, and we still see that 1 down there. We may need to fix that. Pick another person, and see we still get the length here. So what I'm going to do next as a debugging step is I'm going to check. I'm going to say, okay, I am passing the length. That is what I expected. And I'm returning this. Now this doesn't look like I'm returning L anymore. So when you run into a scenario like this, one of the things I always recommend doing is go ahead and clearing your local database. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean my local database and resync my device. Now that my device has been synced, I'm going to go ahead and open up my form, and let's test out the JavaScript again to see what we get. I'm going to choose an employee's name, and now we see that the employee's name is actually showing up. So doing that local database clean actually did make a difference. Choose somebody else, and we'll notice we still only get that first person. That makes sense because we're only returning the first one in the list. So now our next step is to say, okay, we want to get everybody from this subform. So we're going to have to make modifications to this. The first thing is we're going to need to add what's called a for loop. And a for loop is going to have 3 parameters to it. The first one is going to be my counting variable. So I initialize I equal to 0. I want this to run for how many times? As long as I is less than L. And I want to increment I, add 1 to it every single time. Now the other thing is for list, I don't want to just reassign this. I actually want to add to it. So we're going to say list plus equals, meaning it's going to add to what's currently in there. Employee notes I as the index to refer to the current position in the index or in the subform. Now that we have all this set up, we can go ahead and try to save this and take another look at it. Now again, we'll see what we get. We may need to do a local database clean if the JavaScript is caching. If it's not, what we should see is all of the names showing up. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to choose under employee notes, 1 employee. This looks good so far. Now let's see what we get for the second person. Okay, so it's still not showing up, which means again that we're going to need to do a local database clean. And then I'm also going to resync my device. Now that my device has been resynced, let's go ahead and take a look at our form. I'm going to choose a first employee. This looks good. I'm going to choose a second. And this looks good. We have both people down there. Now the only thing is, you'll notice that their names are not separated at all. So we do need to add that in as a last final step. So what I'm going to do is after I add someone to the list, I need to decide if I want to add a comma to the list now. So I'm going to say list plus equals a comma. Now the question is, when should this happen? Because I should not add a comma after the very last employee. So I'm going to put an if statement at the beginning of this. If I plus 1 is less than L. And that basically means that if I add 1 to I and it's still less than my length, then let's add a comma. That means that we have another name to add to our list. I'm going to save this. And we're going to go ahead and resync our device and take a look. Hopefully we don't need to clean the local database a 3rd time. We'll see. As I go ahead and open this up, we're going to pick an employee. Looks good so far. We'll a second employee. All right, so yeah, one more time, we're not getting that comma. So we're going to go ahead and have to clean our local database for a third time, unfortunately. Now, I will say that in testing this, I've had different experiences in terms of how many times I've had to clean my local database. It's a little sporadic, a little unpredictable, but I just always want to go ahead and reemphasize that this is one of the debugging steps that I follow when I'm building out my solutions. All right, our device has been synced. Let's go ahead and take a look. We're going to go ahead and scroll down, fill out our employee notes. It's one person. Let's do another. All right, it's looking good. We got our comma there and not a comma after the last person. We'll add a third one just to make sure that everything is good. All right, and this is looking good. So we have 1, 2, 3 employees, comma separating them. There is not a comma at the end of the line. And we built out our function in a step-by-step process. Now looking at the final product, the way this function works, you're going to pass in the length of the subform. And again, we use the full parent form dot data column name dot length structure. I find that this has the least amount of errors and consistency problems. Then inside of my function, I'm going to make a list, a variable called list, and I'm going to loop through my subform and add each employee's name. After I add the employee's name, I'm going to look to see if there is another employee name in the subform to add. If there is, I'm going to add a comma to separate. And then finally, I'm going to return or output that string list that I've created. So I do have these last two pieces that I wanted to cover at the end of this webinar. This is just a quick cheat sheet for anybody who is doing form building. And again, these are a list of common mistakes that we see people make or common debugging things that we have to address. The first one is that when you're setting up your smart controls, remember that one equal sign is used for setting a value. If you're doing a comparison, you're going to use 2 or 3 equal signs. For your data column names and key values, you want to make sure and remember that they are case sensitive. So you're not able to type a data column name with capital letters and try to match it to the actual data column name, which is lowercase. When you're writing your smart controls, you want to make sure that the casing is equal. When you're working with multi-selects, you want to use this dot index of, and then the value that you're looking for, making sure it's greater than or equal to 0. This is going to return true if the value is found in the multi-select. In tandem with talking about option lists, you want to understand that condition values work like a light switch. What I mean by that is it's also like a red light or a green light. Your condition value is going to start green lighted, meaning each option from the top down is going to be shown until a condition value is false. At that point, you get a red light. Nothing is going to go through until it finds another condition value that is true. Once it's true, then it's green light again, and options continue to be displayed. That's how the segmentation actually works. And then the last one is that whenever you're copy and pasting, you want to double check your formatting, especially with smart controls. I know that I've run into this as well as Barrett, and we've had other people run into this as well, where sometimes formatting, especially on slides for webinars, the quotations may not be the right format, or sometimes underscores need to be changed as well. But just double check those characters to make sure that they are proper. If your smart control doesn't work initially, go in and actually retype the double quote or retype the underscore, and we've seen a lot of times that actually fixes things. The second thing I wanted to have here is that this is a nice little list of default values for various elements. So if you have a text, a read only, a location, or the Manatee Works, which is your barcode scanning element, you want to set it equal to like an empty string or a string that just has a space in it. For select and pick list elements, you can use a -1, or what we're.
So John, I do want to just go back to that first one. So you mentioned that you had the space in that. You can actually set it up without a space and it still works.
Mm-hmm. You mean like this?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Actually, Barrett, so I've found some very, very infrequent caching errors doing this with I believe it was with the location element, or it may have been with the Manatee Works element. This fixed it, and quite honestly, I'm not sure why. But I do tend to do this normally. So for the select and pick list, you can use a -1, or like we saw when Barry gave me a little bit of help, we also use the ZC display key to set it to a specific value. For our multi-selects, we're able to set it to an empty array using double brackets. And then for date times, we can set it to the word date with a capital D and our parentheses here. So that'll give you a default date of the current day today. For number elements, I have this set equal to 0, and I do have a little warning sign here because there are some considerations to keep in mind with number elements. The problem is you can't default a number element to be blank effectively because empty is not an actual number. You can only put in number inputs in that element. So quite frequently we see people put in a 0 because it's kind of the beginning of the element, and then we say, okay, we'll go in and change that. The issue comes up when you have that element be required and the 0 counts as an input. So now it has been filled in effectively. You would then need to use your client validation to make sure that it does not allow the 0 to be part of your input. Okay. Now I know we're running over time a little bit. What I want to do, actually, I want to make sure that I can give the proper attention to this last form building function that I was going to write. So I actually think what I'm going to do, Barrett, is I'm going to record a small segment after the webinar, and I want to attach that to the email follow-up that we're going to send with everyone, and I'll also have it posted on Zerion Academy.
Sure, I think that would be great, and if you add it to the recording or as a separate video, I think that would be really helpful.
Yep, I'm probably going to do both.
All right. Well, with that, John, I know we're going to head out here, but thank you so much, John, for all your effort in going through all this, and thank you everyone who attended today. We will send out an email in the next 48 hours with all the resources.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye.